This is our first experiment in our online talk, but thanks for joining. So this is Sarah Lageson here, and I want to thank Ashley and Rose for helping to organize this. And there will be more of these. This is just the first of many. So thanks for tuning in. And you'll see on your YouTube screen there's a live chat. So if you have a question, feel free to just post it there, either during the talk or at the end. And we will have some time for the Q&A. We just also emailed out the slides as a PDF because sometimes if you're streaming, they get a little blurry. So if you're having trouble there, you should receive a message from Ashley. And with that, I'm going to jump right in. So the talk today is part of a bigger book project that I've been working on for a while. And this is one slice of the book that is trying to conceptualize how criminal records operate in a data context or in a tech context. So a slightly different way than how sociologists and criminologists typically think about a record as being attached to one person, and instead thinking about criminal records as a whole and as a commodity that is bought and sold and increasingly valuable. And today is meant to be very descriptive. So I'm hoping to kind of map out some of the major players and the major institutions here and theorize a bit about how these elements fit together and how these relationships work. So I'm especially interested in getting your feedback on your own observations on how we might theorize more about how this is operating. So the study is motivated by several observations that came from my previous work on ban the box, criminal records, and employment. And a lot of that work sort of had to take for granted what a criminal record is. We could only, in our audit studies, only present one version of a record. But as I got deeper into this work, I realized that criminal record production comes from a lot of different places, really in some ways at the county level and sometimes even more local than that. And while these records carry these enormous consequences while also offering us a lot of potential for smart policing and prosecution, we often take for granted the accuracy and the completeness of this data. Quite simply, a lot of the information is often correct. And once it's out there, they're incredibly impactful, but incredibly difficult to change or remove. And a large part of the way my thinking changed on this had to do with the diffusion of these records across the internet. So there was a major recent shift in where criminal records appeared. They're no longer just at a courthouse or at a state police office. They're widely available in a lot of other places. And this comes from two major sources. And as you'll see, this kind of maps onto the methods that I take in this study. The first is the state-produced versions of records in the digital context. So that might be an online publication of an arrest on a jailhouse roster, a law enforcement website, online booking photos or mugshots, electronic access to court records, online access to prison rosters, people who are currently incarcerated, and computerized criminal history reports, which is like your electronic rap sheet. And those are all available online, but produced by the state. But once made available online, these records are moved into non-legal or extra-legal settings. So this might be something like a sheriff's office has a Facebook account, websites like mugshots.com or busted mugshots, online record purveyors, which are also known as people searches, third-party background checks, which are held under Fair Credit Reporting Act compliance, and then also in just more casual spaces, so community social media, things like nextdoor.com or Crime Watch. So the study's framed around two kind of overlapping frameworks and that lend themselves to a series of questions. The first is thinking about technology from a sociological standpoint. So how do people in a field use new technologies? And I'm talking about both within the state and then within these third parties that are using records. What are the professional and cultural values that guide adoption to new technologies? In a more operationalized sense, how do agencies and data brokers actually frame the work that they're doing? And then for our crowd, the social punishment pushes us to think about how contemporary punishment practices reflect social values, In a more practical point, what is the legal context for sharing this record information? And then from an actor standpoint, how and why are data brokers accessing and disseminating criminal records? So taken as a whole, my thinking about this and the way that things have changed in terms of the production of records have led me to this sort of sociological examination that looks at both the production and the consequences of digital labels. So thinking about criminal records as kind of on a spectrum. And the approach that I take is a field-based approach. And I'm going to borrow from Josh Page's essay on punishment in the penal field to think about how theoretical explanations, as he writes, of penal change and reproduction are powerful, yet they don't sufficiently explicate how macro-level social structural phenomena produce particular punishment outcomes. The intervening mechanism or mechanisms that translate large-scale phenomena into actual outcomes are missing. And he writes that the answer clearly has to do with actors. People make decisions that translate into concrete policies. And he goes on to write that the field itself then is a context that structures the decisions that actors make. It links the micro with the macro, helping us to understand how large-scale phenomena do or do not translate into penal outcomes. Okay, heard that I cut out. Can people hear me? All right, still testing the audio. Anyone can hear me? Okay. Okay, good. All right, good. All right, I hear the audio is working. All right, I'm going to continue then. Sorry, y'all. So we're back to the field approach. So I was, all right, good. Oh, nice to see all your names on there. Hey, guys. So I was quoting Josh's work, and the point here is really that by working with actors, and really by interviewing people, you could start to understand how the institutional values shape the way that practices are put into place. So I'm going to keep going. If you can't hear, just shoot me another note on there. And a field approach rooted in the work of Bourdieu and others, but really thinking about how tech developments create new conditions and new possibilities in the penal field. And asking how tech developments operate as a social structure that contributes to collective anxieties. So thinking about how new technologies not only might change possibilities for changing the way that criminal justice administration is done, but how new technologies might push us towards more strict or more extreme punishments because we have these new ways of doing things. So I rely on these conceptualizations of the penal field and the tech field. So in the penal field, this is really me spending time with actors that control criminal justice administration. And then in the tech field, these are the actors that export these efficiency-based technologies to new settings. So different sets of goals and interests, but interesting overlap, as you'll see in a minute. And all of this leads to the push towards big data commodification. Of course, this is happening in lots of other realms of life, but in criminal justice, it's particularly interesting because this has been a practice that, of course, has been mostly in the purview of the state. And when you have tech companies come in, this really is a disruption of the existing penal field. It's importing institutional values and norms into criminal justice processing to think about record management and administration as the goals rather than traditional goals of criminal justice of rehabilitation or punishment. So really the adoption of tech logic and at the same time, transforming government records into a very valuable commodity that's governed by different laws, that's bought and sold for really, really big contracts, and not only becomes an economic good, but a social good, and a very valuable way to evaluate other people. The outcome, of course, is that this is a very messy and inconsistent, mostly ungoverned strategy of spreading information that produces inconsistent but very persistent criminal punishment. So we'll talk about my methods for a second. The bulk of what I do is mostly interviews. There's 127 interviewees in this study. 73 of them are subjects, so people whose lives are captured in these records. 32 amateur web publishers, so people who use public records to create a neighborhood watch Facebook group or a blog. And then 22 legal and tech professionals. Within each of those categories, there's 3 to 5 people that have really operated as key informants who I've been interviewing over and over. This is supplemented by fieldwork in 3 states. So my dissertation work was in Minnesota at expungement seminars and in the expungement courts. New York does not have any expungement laws, so I've been working with nonprofits that do rap sheet corrections and errors. So they just put their energy into just fixing people's rap sheets rather than sealing them. And then in New Jersey, I'm working with expungement lawyers as well. And then to kind of understand how this works on paper, I've collaborated with some people at Rutgers to do a large-scale analysis of all 50 states and the largest counties in each of those states to understand how different agencies are making criminal records publicly available, whether there's a cost attached to that, and then coding the policies that they actually have written down and the conversations that they've had documented through memos and meetings on how they've made those decisions about disclosure. So taken together, these 3 sources of data will constitute the findings I'm going to share with you. So the way that I've sort of separated all of this in my mind is to think about these players that represent different fields. So you could think about the state, you could think about data vendors, and that's what we'll focus on today, but then also the users of these records, so employers, regular people, neighbors, and then of course the subjects. As I said, today we'll focus on the first 2. And I'll begin with the state. And if you spend time with people who work in CJ administration, especially if they've been there during a big push to make smart prosecution or to synthesize data, you see that there's this paranoia about not being modern enough with record keeping and this push to create really efficient systems, but at the same time to kind of have your own system and to work in your own bubble, not only geographically, but law enforcement versus the courts versus the correctional systems. And there's a lot of boundary maintenance that's done to kind of control one's own agency-specific information. There's some due process elements to that, but there's also just sort of some institutional inertia that causes that separation. So I'm going to walk you through some of the observations I've made about the different agencies and how they manage this. So law enforcement produces criminal records really for means outside of just individualized punishment. So you'll see on the left side of your screen that's Vine is a company that subcontracts with police departments to put their booking photos online. And, this serves a bigger purpose than just notifying or than just documenting that a person is there. This person's attorney or their family can find out if they're incarcerated or not at the jail. But there's a lot of personal identifiers there, and when taken as a whole, a user can flip through a law enforcement website and say, hey, this is what the police are doing, and they're catching these people, and it's a sort of a performance indicator. In the middle, you see the Orange County Sheriff's Office website has a tab in the middle called the public interest page of the website, and if you click on that, you get all the booking photos of people who have been arrested for particular crimes. This one is for prostitution arrests. And finally, on the right there, you'll see a Facebook post from a sheriff's office that just is sort of creating some positive press for themselves. So it's really a way to do some reputation management under the guise of public notification. Now, when you look at the courts, it's a really different story because courts think very critically about public access under the First Amendment. So we have, as people in the United States, we have a right to information under the First Amendment. Courts, a closed court would be a very un-American thing, and so the record itself is meant to be public. When courts moved towards digitizing their own records, though, they were faced with this complicated question of, okay, well, if we can easily access this stuff internally, electronically, should the public be able to access a website and do that? And is that the truest expression of First Amendment compliance? But the courts weren't given resources to manage this. And as we all know, the disposition of a case in a court can change very quickly. It can also change retroactively if something is sealed or expunged, charges are dropped. And so these websites work as an archive of what's happened in the court, but people often interpret them as a record of what's actually happening in the court, as opposed to it being a historical record. And so a very common way, as we've looked through all these different court websites across the country, is that they almost always have a disclaimer that says, we do our best, but this information might not be correct. And so users are supposed to take that with a grain of salt, but as we know, they may not. So moving on to corrections. Prisons often have an inmate locator. Again, this serves a really important role for families in tracking people and knowing when they can visit them and things like that. But if you look at all the different inmate locators side by side, it really does give this veneer of the inmate population as very ordered and very organized. And by being able to access the photographs and the names of the people currently incarcerated, it's really a way that the internet is used to expand or extend carceral control into the community. So you're incarcerated in a physical prison, but you're also documented and cataloged on a website that is wholly public. And the final category that we analyzed was that of computerized criminal histories. A lot of states call these CCHs. And what I found really interesting is that this is really like the core or the foundational information source about someone's criminal history. So this is every law enforcement in court is supposed to pass their information up. It's usually run by the state police. In some states, it's run by the highway patrol, even in more rural areas, or a state's version of the FBI. And though this is sort of the quote, gold standard, and many of these require even fingerprinting matches, and there's been a lot of work in trying to better the accuracy of these are actually the most difficult information to obtain compared to the three other sources that I just talked about. For instance, in New Jersey, you have to go to a private company called Identigo, who specializes in TSA PreCheck. You must get electronically fingerprinted. You have to pay $50 and then wait 2 weeks for your record to come back in the mail to you. Very different than sitting at your computer searching for one's name or your own name within the Essex County court system and automatically and for free pulling up all of the court records. So there is sort of this strange closure and centralization to what should be maybe the standard that we're using. And I'll just share this table with you briefly because this is a brand new analysis. So we finished coding all 50 states. For law enforcement, we coded at the level of the largest county and are using that as a proxy for the state. But you'll see that 82% of states allow online access to the jailhouse rosters, 80% allow online access to court records, 92% allow online access to prison records, 58% allow online access to CCHs. Now, some have paywalls, so you'll see there was no paywalls for law enforcement, but there was for some court records and for some CCHs, or for almost all CCHs. Only one state offers free online access to conviction summaries, and that would be the great state of Minnesota. All other states have some sort of paywall or fee. So the point of this table is really just to show you this is growing phenomena to put things automatically online by the state, articulated through all those kind of different institutional goals that I just described. But of course, the point of a field analysis is to focus on the site of struggle. And if you dive into the documents or when you interview people who've been in these decision-making processes, there is a lot of complications. So I share a quote here from a commission that was trying to figure out what to do with court records in Colorado. And essentially, Colorado was like, hey, we got to digitize our stuff. We're not tech people. We don't know how to do this. So they hired a company to do it. Little did the courts know the company was making a copy of this was when it was on discs. They'd make a copy of the disc and they were selling that to a background check vendor. So they were getting money from the state of Colorado to do the work, and then they were money essentially by selling the data to a vendor. And this was in the earlier years of our thinking about big data. So this is about 2009, 2010. So Colorado canceled the contract. The vendor sued the Colorado courts. They went back and forth. And ultimately, the decision was made that Colorado had to make their information available to the vendor, but they could have a lot more control over it when they renegotiated the contract about how that vendor could sell the information. But what's interesting about this report here is that you see the competing goals. So the report says technology limitations and a desire to keep vendors competitive compel the department to allow this agent to replicate the data to additional vendors. There is a danger in trying to do too much with limited resources and conversely not getting enough accomplished to show value, commitment, and progress. Certainly the state must deal responsibly with its existing, sometimes aging infrastructure. We don't have the human capital to move as quickly as some would wish. Another problem that came up a lot in the fieldwork interviews was this idea of everyone kind of working in their own bubbles. So Dan was working for a DA's office that was on a big overhaul moving towards smart prosecution and sharing data. And he said, 5 years ago, we didn't push data to anybody. Everything was for our own decision making. He's working with the prosecutors. He goes, well, then the court system has their data, and they said this happened. Or the NYPD has this data, and then you guys can use a different agency to track someone who's jail. But the criminal justice agencies aren't working together. The DA and the court system are adversarial. Different boroughs treat the same laws and facts differently. So there's all this information. You've essentially been elected to make sense of it. And this is really common. I talked to another person who worked in a DA's office on a smart prosecution project, and really, she was just handed a person's name and told to go on the internet and just start Googling them. So she would use these people search engines or social media to cobble together a profile, but then only share half of that with the police or only share part of that with defense attorney. So it was a very kind of piecemeal approach that made these conversations about digitizing even more complicated because people wanted to digitize everything, but they didn't want to have to share it once it was in this really easy to repackage and to share formula. And of course, there's a lot of problems that come with electronic record keeping. And I spent a lot of time on this and other work, so I won't do that today. But if you're interested, I would recommend looking up Herring v. United States from 2009 with Bader Ginsburg, warns against the liberty consequences for these kind of the sort of reliance that we have in electronic databases. So Bernie Herring was a guy who essentially had a warrant vacated on paper, but it wasn't vacated in a computer database. So he ended up spending a couple years in jail after getting caught violating his probation. And the Supreme Court did affirm the lower court because there was no proof that this warrant was not updated with malicious intent. It was just a paperwork error. But this is one of the big problems, is that there's not a lot of recourse for people who are incarcerated or stopped or searched or spent time in jail as a result of a mistake. And I have lots to say about that if you want to discuss it in the Q&A. And then for people who work with clients who are dealing with this stuff, they say, again, this is not the malicious intent. These different branches don't mean badly, but they have procedures that they need to follow. There's a lot of blaming of other places in the government. OCA blames DCJS and they blame NYPD. She says it's a valid point that agencies don't pull their own weight, but from a client's perspective, it doesn't matter which agency is messing up. So to kind of summarize this view of the role of the state in producing these records that become commodities. Again, they're working to modernize record keeping. They have limited resources. Then, of course, they're trying to maintain their own institutional control vis-a-vis one another, but also they're forced to rely on tech companies or on data brokers or on IT companies to come in and help them actually do the work. And the result is that we have this very diffused, a lot of mismatched records, really only valuable if you're going to the actual local source. However, everything is made available to the public. And this will move us into the conversation about the data vendors. So their goals are really to collect and to synthesize these public records, and to support their efforts by creating criminal record consumers, both background check companies and the individual consumer. And they really are taking and then reselling data for profit. So there's some important legal context. I won't spend a ton of time in, but the first is to understand that it is totally fine to redisseminate or reshare any information from the public record as long as the government made it public first. So the Cox case focuses on a rape victim's name being published, and the court essentially said, look, the journalist can publish the name, but if the government didn't want it to be out there in the first place, the police should redact it from the police report. So in the digital vein, if the law enforcement agency puts your mugshot on the jailhouse roster, it is perfectly legal for you to scrape it and repost it somewhere else, like on mugshots.com. You cannot create a law so in civil litigation, you can't sue someone for publishing public information. So if I really was arrested, that is a historical fact, and I can't sue mugshots.com for putting my picture up because they're just reporting on an historically accurate moment. This is true even if you are arrested and that record is expunged, even going further than charges just being dismissed. If it's expunged from your legal record, it is still okay for online publications to keep it online, again, because the court is relying on the historical accuracy of the arrest argument. And again, we can talk more about that if you have questions. Now, FICRA does come in, though not as heavy-handed as many think. So if you are a large company and you are going to openly make hiring decisions based on a background check, you do want to work with a vendor that is FICRA compliant. On the screen, there are the different criteria that a FICRA compliant employer and background check company must comply to, which is essentially just telling the applicant what's on their record and why that relates to the job, and then giving them a copy of the report. You'll see, though, there's a screenshot there from LexisNexis that says, because of the notice, though, of background checks, many applicants who have a criminal history either deselect themselves from the process or will alert you to a past offense. So there's sort of an interesting law in the books and law in society disclaimer there. But there's a lot of easy ways to get around FICRA. So any company that has a disclaimer on their website that says you can't use this information to make a hiring decision has self-selected themselves a way out of any sort of FICRA compliance problems. So who are these data vendors? There's a few really big ones, and they have different sort of advertising techniques. So the data vendors are an intermediary between the state that's producing records and then the background check companies that are purchasing the records. And many of the big background check companies actually subscribe to several of these data vendors. But as you can see, they're massively large: 600 million unique records, 350, 550. LexisNexis does not say how many records it has. It's not all 50 states, though, but they do warn, as you see on the bottom there, that you should independently verify any data that you get. So even if you are spending the money to use a data vendor, you really need to go back to the source to ever find out if it's accurate, which of course is an enormous task that most companies aren't going to be able to do. I interviewed one person who works at a CRA that subscribes to a lot of these companies, and he said, every place is different, meaning every court. It's really hard. And he said the rule of thumb for his company is 99% of the time you have to call a clerk at a county courthouse. So even though there's this push towards aggregation, there's also this sense that the information that's coming out is sort of confusing and not necessarily accurate. And as for the non-FICRA data aggregators, this is sort of, I think we've all probably done a Google search, and then like these windows pop up, or these ads that say, Sarah Lageson might have a record, or find out this or that thing. And these are the websites that will kind of clickbait you in. So this first screenshot's from a place called Instant Checkmate. And the bottom is mugshots.com, self-proclaimed as a Google for mugshots. And I think it's interesting because the spirit of these websites is extremely consistent, even though they deliver different products. And it's really The way that mugshots.com puts it is, to this day, no central repository of all these records are publicly available. They're saying these are publicly available official records. So we ask, what good are public records that no one sees? So these companies not only are producing information that can be sold to background check companies, but they're also selling their data to non-FICRA aggregators who are willing to buy it, post it online, but say, hey, you can't use this for any adverse decision making. It's just in the public interest. And to support their efforts, they monetize this at the third end. So not only are the data vendors monetizing their aggregation of data and reselling it to a website, then the website will charge a user. And they're very creative in their marketing here. So you have to click on this notice saying that you understand that you have to be very careful when you're conducting a search, and also that it's very shocking, so please be cautious when you're using this tool. And in the sidebar, you see testimony from different people who have found the service to be helpful. So Katie says that she found out that 6 months ago, a guy that she was dating had domestic battery and rape of a minor. Desiree says it's nice to see who the criminals are in my neighborhood. So you're definitely sort of blasted with all these different warnings that to not pay the $20 for this background check, for this people search, is sort of irresponsible. If you dig in a bit more into the companies that run things like Instant Checkmate, which is the website with the screenshots I just showed you, it's run by a company called the Control Group. And if you go to their website, it's a very different picture. So it's not about this sort of infusing fear into people, but it's really more about efficiency, transparency, and a very Silicon Valley sort of representation of the work that they're doing. So the Control Group owns the website that does the background checks. And so this is their kind of their corporate website. And I was able to interview several people with their attorneys on the record interviews, and they really were, again, using that same sort of argument that we believe making public record information more accessible helps people. This is a quote. The public saves money, has more democratic access to information, and is better equipped to make decisions based on a more complete set of information. They shared lots of stories about people finding long lost relatives, sort of the espousing the benefits of their service. And they reminded me over and over that they prohibit the use of its people reports for any employment, landlord, tenant, or credit decisions. So if we think about this from a theoretical or more academic perspective, the commodification and sale of criminal record data fits very neatly into Malcolm Feely's work about penal entrepreneurs. So we've seen plenty of other instances where a third party comes in and sort of helps with criminal justice. And we have a very rich and permissive legal environment in the United States through the Freedom of Information Act and the First Amendment to let these practices continue. And we're looking at this at a time when efficiency, transparency, and access in the tech world is definitely encroaching on all other parts of life. So think about how medicine has changed, how transportation has changed, how the way you travel has changed. It only makes sense in some ways that this would be imported into criminal justice, even though this really was something that we left only to the states for a long time. And through the production of the dissemination of these records, you get this creation of two new classes. So the people who use the records, and then of course the people who become the subjects of them. As far as the effects, I'm going to show you an image here on the next screen that will just hopefully describe in a micro level how complicated this can get if you are a record holder. So this is, we're doing a couple projects in several states where we're gaining access to people's private-facing criminal history, so something that has all of their dismissals and arrests, and that typically only you or your lawyer can see. And we're comparing that to different publicly available websites. So this is just one single burglary conviction for one person. He was arrested on March 22nd, 2004. So if you're looking at the chart on the left, that gray dot there shows that on his private-facing BCA report, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, we can see that there's an arrest. Now, although that was a private a record, it was purchased by mugshots.com and published on their website. And the date on that on mugshots.com is the same date as the arrest. 2 days later, he's charged in court. So if you go to the online court record, you see that, but that doesn't reflect on any other sources. And then he's convicted about 3 months later. And that shows up, of course, on his private facing record, but then in all of his public facing. So the court record, the instant checkmate report, and the BCA record and are all comprised there. If you go down there, you see where things start to get problematic with data sharing. So on the left, 72407, he has a probation violation for this burglary conviction. Now, when that gets sold and sent through the channels and ultimately end up online, the mugshot.com website says that he's booked for a new burglary, and his instant checkmate report says that he's charged with a new burglary. Now, because we had access to his private facing record, we saw that no, it was a probation violation, totally different offense. But the way that the data were coded, it shows up on his report as a new offense. Same thing happens again in December of 2007, where he has a second probation violation, and then it gets transformed onto these free websites as being a new conviction. And I guess the point here is that these are two very different versions of how the burglary arrest and conviction move through the system. So we're looking at kind of two different sets of facts. And ultimately, we're looking at two very different versions of this person's criminal record, and of course, two different versions of how he's going to be assessed by the various parties that have access to different versions of the records. And I'm going to wrap up here with just a couple anecdotes about what this looks like in person. So, and just to kind of get you thinking about how the technology angle fits into the punishment angle in a really concrete way, and that's when we think about how people are impacted. So we've got Brendan, and I'm comparing him to George. So Brendan had a dismissed charge in 2008. He was later convicted of a different felony in 2012. He's currently incarcerated. But for those 4 years between that first arrest and dismissal and then his subsequent conviction, he worked really hard to get his information off the internet. So he showed up on mugshot websites. He showed up on the Sheriff County Facebook page. And he showed up on a Digilante website because he was accused of a sex crime. And he said that, a police detective believed a crime had committed by me, and I'm quoting from him. I was told by my friends that once the news broke, homeowners associations began warning their residents about a pedophile. There was links to a news article, but this case was dismissed without merit. Then I had to work very hard to bury this story. But for a while, it was the top Google search result for my name. Everyone loves a scandal, I guess. Then Brendan got really creative. So he decided to make a bunch of websites and blogs where he blogged about the TV show Arrested Development, or he would blog about celebrity mugshots. So if you Googled his name, the first page was crowded with his own search results that he created. And this is because the first thing he did when he was released from jail is he went to go see if his stuff was online. And once it was, he got very, very active in learning search engine optimization techniques and worked really hard. The story. And in his words, he says that when he got out of jail in 2008, he realized that he needed to start a new foundation for his digital reputation. I want to compare this to George, who came in to pursue expungement at the clinic. And once we pulled his CCH, we found out that he had a pending case from 1981. Obviously, a paperwork error. He was convicted of a felony in 2007, finished his probation, has been totally fine since. So he's eligible for expungement, but we have to clean up this pending case that's showing up on his criminal history report. So he was a little disturbed by that, but he said okay, and he started the process. And 2 days later, he kind of freaked out, and he sent me an email, and he said, due to the other charge, which is 36 years ago on the report, I don't think I wish to pursue this matter. How can I see you to return the $20? And this is every time someone comes in as part of the research, they get a $20 incentive. And then he said, I looked up the statute of limitations on the internet and I couldn't find anything. Please give me a call at your earliest convenience. And then later he messaged me, computers don't make mistakes, people do. And he was so freaked out by this data entry error that he decided not to even pursue the 2007 expungement. So while Brendan, who has this pretty serious felony conviction that's recent and is already managing his online reputation and dealing with the expungement of his dismissed charges from '08, he's got a very positive relationship with technology. Well, George, on the other hand, had this very negative experience. And of course, he's going to end up not getting his record expunged and letting his mugshot and this open case from 1981 remain online. So I'll draw from Virginia Eubanks. Her book is coming out soon. And in an earlier piece, she writes about critical ambivalence. And she says that, she realized that women at the Y where she was working would repeatedly and enthusiastically sign up for classes in a community technology lab, but then not show up. She said this was a symptom of the mismatch between the image of computers as the route to social and economic progress and these women's own experience of technology as being exploitative, intrusive, and limiting. Rather than being information poor in any simple way, participants in popular technology programs had copious direct experience with large-scale bureaucratic IT systems. So I just kind of want us to think about how we can think about the production of records and how all those different pieces fit together, but I don't want us to be remiss in recognizing that the burden of this big push towards data falls differently on different people. So there are some remedies. There's some push towards not allowing bulk sale of court records and instead only allowing for individual searches. Government's been putting up CAPTCHAs and paywalls. There's been a push to reclassify pre-conviction data, including mugshots, as private and not public. Law professor Yumi Lee just put out a nice piece on that. The ACLU and Legal Aid are doing some FICRA litigation to try to push the PeopleSearch websites under that purview. And there's a growing debate about whether or not this really is the state's problem or whether it should be a search engine problem. So if you want to hear anything about the debate on the search engine side, you just look to the EU, who has a right to be forgotten, which is that, First Amendment protected or journalistic materials won't be censored. However, you can request that your Google search results can be changed so that things like your mugshot don't show up anymore. There is also a push towards reforming CRAs. So there's a group called Concerned CRAs that are using a very consumer-based model and pushing for more accurate information, both for the people who appear in reports, but also for the people that are paying for them, because employers are getting a bunch of crappy information, so it doesn't help them either. So to close, some answers to the questions is really that this consumer orientation of big data vendors has pushed digitization into the states. States knew that they had to change their record keeping, but the question of disclosure and sale was really an external push. And of course, it's to remind us that the technology itself is not deterministic. Just because there's data aggregation possibilities doesn't mean it has to happen. So there is some contextual elements that open the field to this kind of innovation, but it really is these individual agents working at often the county level that need to figure out how to actually make this stuff public. And in terms of the social punishment, how does this reflect social values? Well, transparency and efficiency are certainly privileged over due process. There's an obvious guilt attached to a booking photo or a non-updated court record. The system itself can't function if the information isn't being updated. So expungements don't work. Ban the box doesn't work. A lot of things are complicated by this massive access to information. And of course, it might be worth thinking not only of this as a collateral consequence in terms of punishment, but really the loss of privacy and autonomy and control over one's identity. I think that those are values that we don't talk about enough in criminal punishment that hopefully this kind of work sheds some light on, so that we can continue to think about how autonomy and privacy might fit into what we think about as punishment. And I'll leave some of these broader claims. This is sort of from the book on the last slide here, and but I won't reiterate them. And I think I'm going to stop now that it's 2:45. And I'm watching the live chat window, so if anybody has a question, you can feel free to post it. I will say there's like a 45-second delay from what I'm saying to what you're hearing. So if I don't answer for a minute, I have answered, you just haven't heard it. So, but thank you for tuning in and listening, and thanks for Ashley and Rose for setting this up. Sure. So Ashley talks about is asking about next steps. I'm going to write you back. So next steps. Ashley, I'm going to write back. Sure. From the research end, so this is a big book project. There's a couple pieces that have come out, and the stuff I've published so far has really been on the punishment side and working with the subjects. And so Shad Maroon and I have a piece about rethinking stigma and labeling in the digital age, and from a theoretical perspective. So in some ways, the idea of stigma and labeling is more pressing than ever, but we got to rethink some of the foundational claims about the ability to discredit your stigma or to move on from it. Um, I think the longevity is still unknown and it might change, but for now it's really appalling, the stuff that can come up from 20, 30 years ago. So that's what I've done in terms of writing. For the research, we just got a grant to really track these accuracy issues across 300 people. So we're in a fingerprint state, which is New Jersey. And this is when I showed that slide of the mismatch between the public and private records. It's that was the pilot for that prompted this grant. So we are getting private facing records. We're helping people get connected to attorneys for expungement if they so choose. And then we're basically pulling every public record possible. And we're also paying for FICRA compliant background checks. And we are comparing across platforms and then hoping to track people through expungement, rerun those background checks, and get some sense of compliance. In terms of policy, there's a lot of really great stuff happening, and I've been talking with a lot of lawyers who are kind of also taking this consumer angle of these third-party websites or companies. You should be able to threaten them if their information is bad. So there's a guy in California that just started a website where for $100 you can give him your name and he'll go and he will send pretty serious letters to the owners of websites that have your mugshot or your incorrect arrest information online. And there's some great activism with artists who are doing stuff on mugshots, and so there's definitely, I think, some policy movement happening. I think that I still think the EU offers a really nice model. It's just hard to imagine the right to be forgotten to be imported into a context where, the First Amendment plus Silicon Valley are sort of held as religious gods. They're really on their own level. So I'm not sure that we'll ever get a right to be forgotten. But I think that there is definitely some movement towards giving people automated options to have an incorrect record fixed at the state level or to have things taken off of a mugshot website. In terms of laws, though, the low-hanging fruit has been for states to not allow exploitation, or essentially they made it illegal for websites to charge takedown fees if they're a non-FICRA website. So like mugshots.com or Instant Checkmate has to fix your information or take down your mugshot for free. It's just, you're asking a lot for someone who's already freaked out by the justice system and by the internet because their pictures on the internet to go and send threatening letters to the owners of these websites. So there's, as law and society people, we know that there's a mobilization problem in those laws, but that's sort of what's been happening so far. Okay, so Chase asks, just thinking about new forms of social control. Credit system. Yeah. So there's, if you've read everyone's with Jim Jacobs' book about criminal records, he also, is writing from New York and he's in a non-expungement state. And so New York issues these certificates of rehabilitation that have been touted in some sources as sort of being a way to combat the negative state-produced credential. So I guess I could see some sort of parallel in the private sector, and I can share this website with you all, that this defense attorney that's trying to do this on his client's behalf, which is sort of the social credit kind of thing. Is it realistic or possible? I mean, there's plenty of people who think that all of this needs to happen outside of the state, that like the state doesn't know how to produce records properly, how to manage their stuff. It's Pandora's box has been opened, and now it's gonna be up to tech giants to set the moral framework for what's publicly available or not. I don't know, Chase, where I land on that yet. Like, stay tuned. But but if we've given a lot of control over to Lexis and CoreLogic and backgroundchecks.com already, so it's to retreat from that would mean to invest very heavily in IT infrastructure at the state level, and to force work groups across the state, from courts and the police and corrections and the state police, to work together. The courts are also, I think, a really ripe area for policy reform, because they've just sort of gone extreme in public and everything's so cheap. That's really where most of the vendors are going. They're not going to pay money to the state police to get those $50 per records. It's just inefficient. So they will, and you can Google for your own state, you can look up the contract for the bulk sale of court records, and usually get those numbers, and you can actually see there's different versions. There's like criminal and traffic only. There's a whole market for this for landlords, for eviction histories and eviction court records. So just a side note. Okay, Ashley asked, the tech savvy Brendan was fascinating. Was he on the younger side? Yeah, Brendan is, I thought he was really atypical until I started getting more into the mugshots world. And there's a lot of people whose mugshot are online, who are very tech savvy and very good at burying their mugshot. And yes, he was younger for sure, and definitely part of that savvier group. So I've been doing some research trying to, I don't know if digital divide is like the right word to use anymore, but thinking about like the age graded digital divide. So, or even, social class, which is how much does reputation management fit into this? And like, what a weird way to think about criminal justice and think about punishment. But there's definitely reputation management websites, and some are really expensive. People I've talked to have spent $3,000-$4,000. So there's sort of like that. You have an advantage there. Or if you're good at burying things on your search results, or if you have a common name, honestly, you can hide. People with uncommon names kind of get screwed by this. But I think what Brendan had his finger on was not super unique. I think that there's a lot of people. I mean, all of us here probably are pretty aware of our online presence and what turns up in Google search results. So the more popular these websites become, the more aware people are that they exist, and then the more proactive they are in trying to get their stuff down if need be. Again, if you don't have access to a computer, if you're already kind of frazzled by bureaucracy, I don't think you're going to pursue those remedies, which speaks to the inequality problem. Okay, Sebastian says, it seems that big data is being constructed as a type of uncontroversial fact, synonym of sound research and analysis. Yeah, that's really well put. I hope everyone can see what Sebastian said. Why has big data been insulated from critical examination? So Andrew Ferguson's book just came out about the rise of big data policing, and he definitely touches on that. I know the Virginia Eubanks book that's coming out next week is definitely going to interrogate that. And then I can't remember who wrote it, but Weapons of Math Destruction, Kathy O'Neill, her book. So there's like siloed conversations that are critiquing algorithmic thinking in general. There's a colleague of mine, a legal scholar, Andrew Selbst, Selbst, has done some great work on just inequality and algorithms in general. But a lot of those critiques focus on a very particular use of big data, which is to produce a decision. whether it's in education or health or in criminal justice. And I think I'm thinking through this as I talk. Sebastian, thanks for this idea, which is that these bulk data requests don't have a desired end. In fact, the vendors have no idea where the stuff is, how it's being used or where it's going. And I think that that's a way that they do insulate themselves from critical examination. Over and over, you hear this same line that this is publicly available. It's the public record. So everyone kind of passes the buck. The data vendors say, well, the state needs to fix it if they've got problems with it. And the state says it's not our job to be IT people. So the big data vendors should be doing the matching and the identity stuff. And then the background check companies say, well, why can't the vendors give us good information? Why do we have to call the county court? And then, of course, the person who's the subject just gets stuck in the middle. So, yeah, a great observation, Sebastian. Totally spot on. He's for sure, because I think just like big data writ large has been left alone. And like they're making a lot of money, so it's there's certainly no like critical pause that's going to happen from within the industry. All right, so I'll wait a couple of minutes if there's any other questions. If not, we can depart from our YouTube conference. Yes. So Ashley just invoked the question of risk-based analyses and prediction software. Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, it's kind of has made me uncomfortable with our field in a lot of ways because when we get data from, so not even going into the sort of the decision based algorithms or risk assessment tools, but thinking about how we understand crime is problematic. And if you really sit down with I was with a data analyst from a police department around here the other day, and I was asking her some basic questions. She's trying to help me with something, and she was like, "Oh, everything's a mess. Like we have to redo our comp stat by hand every week because the computer does it wrong." And if you just really get into the weeds of how the data are produced, it's not great, because they're not researchers, and it's done for a different reason. But then when we as researchers or as people who are doing predictive work in a more applied sense get that data, that's a problem. And how often do we as sociologists or criminologists call the person with the record or talk to the court administrator, pay for an entire court record trying to understand whether or not this really should count as recidivism? Was this person really charged with this thing? So for me, it's made me have to kind of think critically about my own uses of publicly available, even privately available, but like produced by the state and shared with researchers data. So yeah, so I think it would serve us well to do more field work and ethnographic work in the data production side. And I think people are definitely interested in that. It's just that it's really idiosyncratic and messy and methodologically complicated, which shouldn't stop us from doing that. But yeah, actually, it's a good point. It's also true that, yeah, if people have some control over their reputation management or privacy, and they can go in and manipulate their own record, what does that mean for either how we understand that person or how we understand patterns writ large? Yeah, actually, that's another good point. A lot of times, too, what's reflected in these data are so if you're looking at just law enforcement data, and I'm talking about if I use Instant Checkmate and they've scraped or had an agreement with a bunch of law enforcement agencies, they're only going to be reporting on their report the arresting offense. Now, if you are going to go to the court records, you're going to see all the offenses that the prosecutor charged, and there's rampant over arresting and overcharging because of how those stats reflect the productivity of that office. If you talk to people who work in the field, they say, well, of course we know half of that stuff's going to be dropped. But when it appears on the court record and it goes public, that it can be replicated. Yes, and so it goes back, I think, to, I hope I made that point clear, that the CCH probably is the best version, but it's also the hardest to get access to. It's expensive and it's closed. So I think if policy people want to push on that, that would be a really important thing to look at. All right, so Phil has a good question that he's going to hear the answer to in 6 minutes. Why ban the box has worked in the US, but not the EU style of right to be forgotten? Yeah, so didn't ban the box seem to kind of violate the rights of employers? That's a good question. I think it has to do with where, if and how a record is reported. So the right to be forgotten is focused on things that have already been published and are available online. So the case was this guy in Spain had gotten in some trouble with money, and he, was found not guilty, and he moved on with his life, but then he couldn't get back into business because these news reports were coming up. So again, in Europe, they don't have mugshot websites, and no justice system information is made publicly available like this. So this was the right to be forgotten was really more about journalistic coverage of an event. So they said, yes, part of your dignity rights here in the EU is to manage your public-facing identity. So therefore, you can petition Google to take down search results. Now, that original news article, that's archived on this Spanish website. That's going to stay there. But when I Google this guy's name, it's not going to come up. So there's a lot of the kind of more like tech privacy advocates in this world are pushing for that thinking, where they think it's ridiculous that Google allows this kind of content to come onto search results. They think there should be a blanket ban because it's just egregious content. As soon as mugshots don't show up on Google search results, those websites go away. Unless you are like navigating to mugshots.com and specifically searching for a person. But often people find these inadvertently and then they get into the rabbit hole. So that's why I think the right to be forgotten works so well in the EU, is that the state is not making stuff public. It has to be this third party, and then the third party fixes it. And then as for why ban the box would work, so that, I don't know. I'm not totally sure how the two completely overlap, but I do see your point that it takes information away in a similar sense in ban the box and in the right to be forgotten. I mean, I think with ban the box, it's that the argument rests on equal access to a job. So getting your foot in the door, letting your credentials speak for itself. So I think it was definitely a way to get rid of sort of blanket discrimination based on records. And we're all familiar with the debates that are happening around ban the box now and unintended consequences. But I think that ban the box ultimately worked because employers do still have access to this information. They just can't ask it on a job application. So work that's coming out now is showing that there's also a chilling effect of saying, you got to pass a background check, and writing that in an application might have the same effect of opting out that asking about a criminal record might have. If we said ban the box meant employers could never know, I don't think we'd have much luck passing it in the US. Good question, Phil. I like how you brought in the two movements, though. It's interesting. Yeah, good question. Ashley asks, do you know how often the online data is wrong? That is the goal of the study that I'm conducting now. I'd love to have more precise estimates. The one issue is that to decide what the baseline is. So I've been using the CCH private facing version because that is produced centralized through the state, has the dismissals and all the arrests, sometimes juvenile stuff on there. Not missing it, but includes false data. Yeah. So if I use that as a baseline and I compare it across different sources of information, you can see how the source might um, change the name of something or report it incorrectly, sort of the way that that schematic was showing the probation violations as new offenses. The thing is, I can't give you a number on that yet, though. I don't know like what percentage of the time. So the National Employment Law Project and another kind of consumer agency has done reports where they've looked at FBI background checks, and the measurement of error is very, very high. Um, and I do think I get pushed on the slide. Is it missing data or is it false data? I think a lot of times there's I think the bigger problem is with over-reporting. So reporting expunged, sealed, or dismissed charges. And that was the biggest critique with these FBI reports, is that once the state got them to the FBI was so slow to import the data that if someone's charges were dropped, the FBI didn't get notice in time to take it off, and then they would send it back and it would be terrible and wrong. But like the journalists that'll call me, I always want to ask about missing data. They say, well, these background checks are bad because, you know, rapists are slipping through and becoming Uber drivers. Like, how do we improve that? And, you know, my answer is that, well, then employers should go straight and have a relationship with the courts or the state police and try to actually get good information. But again, it's a resource thing. People aren't going to pursue the source of the information. They want it packaged for them through the multi-staging of government production, data vendor, background check company. The wrong person listed happens all the time. So I have lots of fieldwork examples of people who come in and say, that wasn't me, this isn't me. I've got a guy, I opened the book with a vignette about a guy who's a bunch of convictions from 1901. He was like, obviously I wasn't alive then, you know? And so the wrong person thing comes up before fingerprint-based arrest data and tracking of people. People use other names all the time. So I've a guy that came in last week that had two things from 1978, and he was like, I know that was my cousin. Like, I remember when this was happening. And there's not much that you can do about it. Also, like juniors and the thirds, they get really messy. States try to centralize around an ID, like the NICID in New York, but they don't do a great job of that sometimes. So yeah, so I didn't talk a lot about what you do if your record's wrong, but basically the burden is on you and only you to pay for every version of it, to go after every source of it, and to keep checking like every 6 months to see if those records are maintained with accuracy. So if you have problems on your record, you're looking at like a 3 to 5 year, multi-$1,000 excursion and trying to get it fixed. Okay, so Rose asks, the problem in Canada is how an error in a record gets repeated across files. It's still littered in other documents. It's the same as, is it possible to clean up errors before making data public? I think it's totally possible because we figure this out for other industries all the time. Companies wouldn't pay millions of dollars for consumer market info and all the consumer profiles that we have on ourselves if it was all wrong. And so if we value that to a certain degree where we demand accuracy, and why wouldn't we demand it here when there's liberty at stake? So I really think if a state was going to do it right, they would need to centralize all of their data operations, and they should not rely on a third party to come in and do it for them, because often those third parties will just work with police or they'll just work with courts. So each state really should have a very, very robust task force for integrating data. That data should be what gets shared with vendors and what gets shared with the FBI. Now, people in the tech world are convinced that this is going to be all blockchain things. So, I mean, definitely not my area, but I'm trying to learn. But essentially, like if something gets updated in the courtroom, it should be updated on every other version of someone's record. I mean, that's the future for data in general. The question is, do criminal justice administrators care enough? Is there enough institutional support for spending in that area? So it's going to have to be a subject or a person-driven movement. People are going to have to demand that the information is correct. And it's just, there's been like so little activity around this. It's kind of a boring thing to have a protest about. It's like, I want my paperwork to be proper. And so that's been a frustration for me in terms of the public putting any pressure on their local government to centralize operations within the state. Okay, so I think we might be wrapping up, but I'll wait. Okay, so I put myself on here so you can see me. Ashley asks, are errors at all correlated with poverty, race, etc.? I would expect we won't do anything as a country to fix it if low status people are the victims. I totally agree with that. So there's not a lot in our field that's done these kind of correlational work between who is impacted the most. And my field work definitely has anecdotal evidence that, like Brendan versus George, you can kind of see who's going to be impacted the most. And yes, I think that political activity is not going to be super strong if the people who are impacted the most are also dealing with a lot of other issues. But I have been reading a lot in the privacy law and the digital law areas. There's some legal academics doing really cool empirical work on the risks, the privacy risks, and the information technology risks that low-income populations face. Mostly because a lot of what people do now is on their phones, and if your phone is like the center of your universe, if you're like an Uber driver, if you're getting employment through apps, you are constantly sharing information, and there's a lot of digital vulnerabilities. So I think that for people in our field, I think that's a really good place to draw from, is this idea of who's more vulnerable to kind of big data intrusions in general. And then you multiply that by what we know about the justice system and who's impacted. And I think there's a good nexus there. But yeah, I think that your intuition along those lines is correct. All right. Any other questions? This has been pretty fun. Okay, so we might have one more question, and then awaiting technical difficulties. To be honest, I thought we'd have way more tech difficulties than this. Yeah, Ashley has a interesting, and I think be a really empirically interesting question too, but also just interesting in general. She says, I can imagine the one hand errors would be randomly distributed, but if there are stereotypical names in the system that would overly victimize people with those names without a record. So yeah, there's been like anecdotal evidence of this. People with really common names are like, oh my God, I Google myself and there's like 25 different people with a record. In some ways, I think you can actually hide a bit more if the information is confusing and there's all these different names. How would an employer know if it's actually you? So I think there's a problem there. I think the question about the distribution of error, though, actually comes a lot more to how much infrastructure the state or the county has put into data. So like some of these websites they're just really bad. Like the court websites are terrible and they're not updated and they just leave all this stuff on there and it's very cluttered. Others are pretty savvy and are live updated, or they're very clear about how their data are collected and how long it's maintained. So I think that there's like a resource, it's much more of a resource thing in terms of the distribution of the errors. And states have different laws about what's public and what's not, and how we should share things. And so if you go to a very open state, you go to Harris County, Texas, like everything is online all the time, and they're really proud of that. And then you go to other states where there's nothing on it. So I think like Maine is a state where you just, like, there's nothing, they just don't share it. And so there's also this geographic distribution of publicity that, is sort of like bummer for you if you're arrested in this county and not this county. Okay, looks like we have hit 3:15, and just please email me if you have interest in this or want to talk about it, or if your work overlaps and we could team up on something. I'd love to hear about that. Otherwise, thanks everybody. I'm gonna turn off the stream, and I will see you in Toronto in person. Take care. Bye.